The Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, it was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, peaking in Europe between 1347 and 1351. It's believed to have originated in Asia, traveling along the Silk Road, and finally reaching Europe via the fleas living on the backs of rats that so frequently traveled on merchant ships. The plague mercilessly swept through towns and cities, decimating populations and causing widespread panic and chaos. Estimates suggest the Black Death killed perhaps between 30 and 60% of Europe's total population, leaving a drastically different world in its wake. Hello and welcome to the channel. Well, if you are new here, it's good to meet you, and if you're coming back, you must know what you're in for. As always, if you'd want to support the channel, link to the Patreon is in the description if you like what I do. Otherwise, let us continue on to 10,000 subscribers. Help me out with that with a like and subscribe. Well, with all of that out of the way, let's get on to the real unpleasantries. I'm sure you already know from the introduction perhaps what you're in for. We're going to go on a little bit of a deep dive into the origins of the Black Death, or the bubonic plague, or the Black Plague, or whatever you wish to refer to it as. And then we're going to talk extensively about the consequences. What kind of world was left behind after so much suffering? In fact, it's the world that we live in now. So, I suppose we better understand it. First we'll begin. The term, the Black Death, was not initially used to specifically refer to the 1347 plague in any European language, although it had been used previously to describe fatal diseases. This term, Black Death, started to be associated with this plague in English only in the 1750s. It first appeared to translate the Danish term Den sort død, the Black Death. This label was popularized by Swedish and Danish chroniclers in the 15th and into the early 16th centuries, and was later translated into other languages, including Icelandic and German. Of course, French you'll often see in the artworks Le Mort Noir. Well, before this, many European languages had named the illness with phrases derived from Latin, such as magna mortalitas, meaning the great death, magna meaning great, and mortalitas, well, you know. Now, this phrase, Black Death, as a description of death being black, actually has some rather ancient roots. For example, Homer even used it in the Odyssey, the very early work from ancient Greece, to describe the monstrous Scylla, whose mouths were full of black death, as the text reads. Seneca the Younger may have been the very first to use Black Death, or in Latin mors atra, to describe an epidemic, emphasizing the severe and grim nature of the disease rather than its color. In the 12th or 13th centuries, French physician Gilles de Corbel used atra mors to refer to pestilential fever in his writings on disease symptoms. Now, the term mors negra, the Black Death, was used by Simon de Covino, a Belgian astronomer, in his 1350 poem On the Judgment of the Sun at a Feast of Saturn. He attributed the plague to an astronomical conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. though his usage does not definitively link to the 1347 plague, and seems to more connotate the deadly outcome of the disease. Now, in the writings from 1893, one historian, Cardinal Francis Aidan Gasquet, suggested the pandemic was a type of the common Eastern or bubonic plague. Later, in 1908, Gasquet referenced that the term atra mors for the 14th century epidemic first appeared in 1361 in a Danish history book by J.I. Pontanus, which he noted, and I quote, "Commonly and from its effects, they called it the Black Death." So how did all this come about? How did it happen that Europe was riddled with this horrible illness? Well, we'll try to trace it back to Genoa. Plague was reportedly first introduced to Europe through the Genoese traders from their port city of Kaffa in Crimea in 1347. During a prolonged siege of the city between 1345 and 46 by the Mongol Golden Horde led by Ani Beg, whose troops were suffering from the disease, they decided to engage in some early chemical warfare. They had the fine idea to hurl the infected corpses via catapults over the walls into the city of Kaffa, attempting to infect the inhabitants. Well, that's one theory, and that did happen, of course. But it's also probable that infected rats crossed the siege lines, contributing to the spread of the epidemic among the residents. Either way, as the plague began to take hold, the Genoese traders fled across the Black Sea to the large city of Constantinople, marking the arrival of the disease in Europe in the summer of 1347. The plague's impact in Constantinople was devastating, claiming the life of the 13-year-old son of the Byzantine Emperor John VI Cantacosenos, who chronicled the disease, drawing parallels to Thucydides' account of the earlier plague of Athens during the 5th century BC. He noted the disease's transmission via ships among maritime cities. Another contemporary, Nicephorus Gregoras, wrote to Demetrius Kidones, describing the escalating death toll and the complete futility of medicine. This, of course, ensued panic among the populace. Well, the initial outbreak in Constantinople lasted about a year, with the plague recurring several times until the year 1400. Of course, each year everybody had to simply wait for that dreaded plague season, and most years it came in varying intensities. The disease had reached Sicily in the October of 1347 aboard 12 Genoese galleys, spreading rapidly across the island. These galleys then proceeded to Genoa and Venice by January 1348, but it was an outbreak in Pisa just a few weeks later that served as the gateway for the plague into northern Italy. By the end of January, one of the galleys expelled from Italy brought the plague to Marseille. From Italy, the plague began to spread across Europe, reaching France, Spain, Portugal, and finally England by June 1348, subsequently spreading through Germany, Scotland, and Scandinavia from 1348 to 1350. It entered Norway in 1349 with a ship that landed at Askøy, spreading further to Bjørgvin, modern-day Bergen, and finally reaching northwestern Russia by 1351. Regions with less established trade networks, such as most of the Basque County, isolated parts of Belgium and the Netherlands, and secluded alpine villages, did experience the plague, yes, but to quite a lesser extent. Epidemiologists suggest that periods of unfavorable weather could have decimated plague-infected rodent populations, pushing their fleas to seek other hosts, which of course led to outbreaks. These outbreaks often peaked during the hot summers of the Mediterranean and the cool autumn months of the southern Baltic regions. Additionally, prevailing malnutrition weakened immune responses, significantly contributing to the vast decline in the European population during this period. Oh, and we have a passage from a contemporary source, by the way, Geoffrey the Baker, in his work Chronicon Angliae, who wrote about the plague thusly. The 7th year after it began, it came to England, and first began in the towns and ports, joining on the sea coast, in Dorsetshire, where, as in other counties, it made the country quite void of inhabitants, so that there were almost none left alive. But at length it came to Gloucester, yea, even to Oxford and to London, and finally it spread all over England, and so wasted the people that scarce the 10th person of any sort was left alive. So you can see from that, not a good situation, Well, by autumn of 1347, the plague had reached Alexandria in Egypt, and that was a huge city, having been transmitted by sea from Constantinople via a merchant ship that was carrying slaves. This marked the beginning of the pandemic's spread through Middle East and North Africa, regions that would see significant depopulation and lasting changes in their economic and social structures. By the late summer of 1348, the plague had reached Cairo, the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, and also a major cultural hub of the Islamic world. Cairo was the largest city in the Mediterranean basin at the time, and the outbreak, of course, had devastating effects, with more than a third of its 600,000 inhabitants dying. Of course, this was indiscriminate. Those numbers included women and children, everybody. Nobody was safe. The child sultan, however, and Nasir Hassan, did manage to flee the city. Despite Cairo's advanced medical facilities, at least for the time, including the medieval hospital of the Calawun complex, the Nile River was practically choked with corpses. The historian Al-Makrizi noted the plague's dramatic impact on Cairo, with an increase in demand for grave diggers and those to perform funeral rites. He reported that the plague recurred in Cairo more than 50 times over the subsequent 150 years. In 1347, the plague spread eastward and reached Gaza, modern-day Palestine, by April, Damascus, modern-day Syria, by July, and Aleppo, also in Syria, by October. Throughout that year, it affected several cities across what is now Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Palestine, including Ascalon, Acre, Jerusalem, Sidon, and Homs. By 1348 to 1349, the disease had reached Antioch, leading to significant population flight northward, with most fleeing residents dying on the journey. Within 2 years, the plague had permeated the entire Islamic world, from Arabia to North Africa, and anybody who fled, who managed to not die on the journey, simply brought plague with them. Simultaneously, the pandemic spread westward from Alexandria along the African coast. By April of 1348, Tunis, modern-day Tunisia, was infected by a ship from Sicily. At the time, Tunis was under siege by a Moroccan army, which, after dispersing in 1348, helped spread the disease to Morocco. Well, it is possible that the epidemic in Morocco was also influenced by interactions with the Islamic city of Almeria in Al-Andalus. In 1348, Mecca experienced an outbreak due to the influx of pilgrims performing the Hajj. The Rasulid Sultan of Yemen, Al-Mujahid Ali, was released from Mamluk captivity in Egypt in 1351 and carried the plague back to Yemen upon his return. Throughout 1349, there are records of a massive epidemic in Mosul and a second significant outbreak in Baghdad, both of these cities being extremely large population centers. So what happens when you get the plague? How do you know? How does it feel? Well, it doesn't feel great. Let's have a look at that. The plague, often characterized by high fever, ranging from 38 to 41 degrees Celsius, about 100 degrees to 106 degrees Fahrenheit, headaches, painful joints, nausea, vomiting, and just a general feeling of illness. Well, all of this came together to prove fatal for approximately 80% of the untreated individuals, and within only 8 days of the symptom onset. 8 very miserable days, by the way. Symptoms noted during the pandemic varied widely, but one of the most common was the appearance of swollen lymph nodes or buboes, particularly in the groin, neck, and armpits. These buboes were basically big welts that would appear on the skin and keep swelling up, frequently oozing with pus and bleeding when opened. Make sure you perhaps don't listen to this video while eating at this point. Well, one of the most vivid contemporary descriptions comes from Boccaccio, who observed that both men and women developed tumors in the groin or armpits, some as large as a common apple, and others as small as an egg. Either way, you do not want them. From these areas, the deadly infection rapidly spread throughout the body. Shortly thereafter, patients would often exhibit black spots or livid patches on their skin, particularly on the arms, thighs, or other parts of the body. These spots varied in size and number, but were considered as ominous as the buboes, predicting the fatality of the infection. Also, contributing to the name, the black spots, the Black Death. You can see how they came to that. Patients typically experienced acute fever and began to vomit blood, succumbing to the disease within 2 to 7 days after these symptoms appeared. Another possible symptom was a rash resembling flea bites, suggesting an additional method of transmission. Beyond the common form of plague, other variants included pneumonic and septicemic plague. Pneumonic plague primarily attacked the lungs, leading to severe respiratory issues, fever, cough, and blood-tinged sputum. As this form of the disease advanced, the sputum turned bright red and became a lot more copious. The mortality rate for pneumonic plague was alarmingly high. If you thought 80% was bad, try between 90 to 95% for the pneumonic plague. I don't like those odds. Well, don't worry, it gets worse. With septicemic plague, which was admittedly less common, but it was nearly almost fatal, with a mortality rate close to 100%. This form manifested through high fevers and skin patches, but this time the patches were purple, resulting from disseminated intravascular coagulation. Unlike the bubonic form, septicemic and particularly pneumonic plague progressed so swiftly that the typical buboes might not even have time to develop. The plague itself is estimated to have killed up to 75 million people, and that's just in the 14th century, a time when the global population was below 500 million. Of course, the death toll figures vary widely, with historical research continuously updating and revising the estimates. In Europe alone, the death toll was of course staggeringly high, with estimates suggesting that between 1/3 and half of the European population perished between 1347 and 1351. Some regions experiencing mortality rates as high as 80%. Contemporary accounts, like those of Jean Froissart, estimated the death toll at 1/3, possibly echoing the biblical allusions of the Book of Revelation to underscore the catastrophic magnitude of the plague. The distribution of deaths across Western Europe was uneven, with some areas experiencing minimal impact, while others faced near total depopulation. The plague disproportionately affected urban centers, where high population densities and unsanitary conditions facilitated the spread of the rapidness of the disease. Major cities like Florence saw their populations drastically reduced. Florence's population, for example, decreased from about 120,000 in 1338 to only 50,000 in 1351. Similarly, Hamburg and Bremen lost 60 to 70% of their populations. In the French regions of Provence, Dauphine, and Normandy, the population decreased by 60%. The town of Givry in Bourgogne recorded an extraordinary number of deaths in 1348, with half of them occurring in September alone. In some parts of Norway, up to 60% of the population perished in the 2 years of 1348 and 1350. London and England in general saw massive declines, with English population plummeting from 7 million to just 2 million by the year 1400. However, Some areas, like the Kingdom of Poland, parts of Hungary, and certain regions within modern Belgium and Spain, initially managed to escape the plague, though they were later affected by subsequent outbreaks. These areas' initial resistance to plague is not really well understood. There's no real explanations for it, but some historians do speculate that genetic factors may have played a role. Either way, when the plague did strike, it struck all social classes, with the lower classes who lived in the more congested and unsanitary conditions being particularly more vulnerable. Notable deaths included monarchs such as Alfonso XI of Castile and Joan of Navarre. The plague also claimed the lives of members of the royal families across Europe, including Peter IV of Aragon's wife and daughter, and Joan of England, daughter of Edward III, who died en route to Spain for her marriage. The Emperor of the Byzantine Empire also lost his son, and in France, Bonne of Luxembourg, the wife of the future John II, succumbed to the disease. The demographic impact of the Black Death in Asia, particularly in China, was also staggering. The region experienced multiple epidemics and famines from the 1200s through the 1350s, culminating in a dramatic population decrease. For example, a severe outbreak in Hubei province in 1334 reportedly claimed up to 80% of the population. Well, overall, China's population declined significantly, from an estimated 125 million to 65 million by the late 14th century. Well, back to Europe, I want to read an account that we have from an Italian chronicler who had the unfortunate experience of experiencing the plague firsthand in Siena in 1348. So here is an account from Agnolo di Tura. Father, abandoned child. Wife, husband. One brother, another. For this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight. And so they died, and none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priest, without divine officers. Great pits were dug and piled beneath with the multitude of the dead. And they died by the hundreds, both day and night. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. And I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And there was also those who were sparsely covered with earth, that the dogs dragged them forth, and devoured many bodies throughout the city. There was no one who wept for any death, for all awaited death, and so many died that all believed that it was the end of the world. End of the passage from Agnolo di Tura. In the Middle East, quantifying the exact demographic effects of the plague is a bit of a challenge, mainly due to the scarcity and variability of historical records. Rural areas were particularly hard hit. Many rural inhabitants simply abandoned their homes and livelihoods, leading some regions to being completely depopulated. Urban centers also suffered profound losses. In Gaza, the 1348 outbreak resulted in approximately 10,000 deaths. Aleppo saw death rates as high as 500 people per day during the outbreak, and in Damascus, daily deaths reached a peak of 1,000 during September and October of 1348. By the time the epidemic subsided in the March of 1349, Syria had lost an estimated 400,000 people. Despite these grim figures, the overall mortality rate in the Middle East might have been lower than in some parts of Asia and Europe, potentially less than 1/3 of the total population, according to some scholars. However, this rate varied across different areas, with some locations experiencing much higher mortality rates. In the 14th century, explanations for the causes of the Black Death ranged from the supernatural to the astrological. People were, of course, bewildered and unable to explain what was going on through natural causes. Many believed that such a devastating pandemic simply must be the result of divine wrath, or perhaps the influence of the stars. Giovanni Boccaccio, a contemporary Italian writer, speculated whether the plague was simply a punishment from God, or perhaps the result of some celestial force. Amid all this uncertainty and fear, scapegoating flourished. European Christians concocted all sorts of conspiracy theories, including accusing Jews of poisoning wells and plotting to destroy Christian civilization. These accusations, of course, led to widespread massacres of Jewish communities. The ones that weren't massacres simply got kicked out of whatever city they were in. In one of the most horrific incidents, about 2,000 Jews were massacred in Strasbourg in February of 1349, and later in that year, large Jewish communities in Mainz and Cologne were also completely wiped out. Authorities responded to the crisis in various ineffective, or sometimes even counterproductive ways. Governments enacted measures like banning the export of foodstuffs, instituting price controls on grain, and outlawing large-scale fishing to stabilize prices and maintain supplies. However, these regulations were difficult to enforce, and were, more often than not, just flat-out ignored. Additionally, the prohibition on food exports, combined with widespread crop failures due to a labor shortage caused by the plague, meant that countries like England could neither produce enough grain nor even import it. Consequently, any available grain was often seized by pirates or just sold on the black market. England and France, already depleted by the ongoing Hundred Years' War, which began in around 1337, faced additional strain from inflation, malnutrition, and poverty, marking the continent particularly susceptible to the tragedy of the plague. It's been argued that the Black Death initially had a leveling effect on society. It reduced the population drastically, which in turn increased the value of labor and decreased the value of the land, if, of course, you were around long enough to see it. This shift temporarily reduced economic inequality and improved conditions for the workers. However, the effect was not lasting, as demographic recovery eventually restored the old economic disparities. Moreover, laborers, artisans, and craftsmen saw their real incomes decline in the quarter century following the Black Death due to inflation, despite all of the initial improvements. By 1357, 1/3 of London's properties were vacant due to the severe impact of the plague. The overall population continued to decline until around 1420, complicating efforts to understand the long-term economic impacts of the plague. Additionally, the disruption of trade within the Mongol Empire, exacerbated by the Black Death, is cited as a contributing factor to its eventual decline. The plague significantly impacted the social structure of England and Western Europe, leading to more favorable outcomes for the peasants who survived. The massive population decline had led to social mobility, decreased obligations to remain on traditional landholdings, and the virtual disappearance of serfdom. Land became plentiful, wages rose, and it became possible for individuals, especially younger sons and women, to move about and improve their social status. As population growth resumed, however, these benefits were countered by renewed deprivation and famine. And in Europe, well, they made laws against this sort of thing, which we'll get to in a moment. Well, in a stark contrast, Eastern Europe saw an increase in the stringency of laws, which further tied peasants to the land through intensified serfdom. The reduction in population also led to lower land prices and more available food for the average peasant, contributing to a significant increase per capita income over the following century. With more farmland available for pasture, the consumption of meat and dairy products increased, as did exports of beef and butter from regions like the Low Countries, Scandinavia, and northern Germany. However, the upper classes, well, they couldn't have the peasants making money and improving their lives, now couldn't they? They attempted to resist these social changes by implementing sumptuary laws to prevent peasants from adopting the lifestyles, or indeed the appearances, of higher social classes with their new-found wealth. Additionally, attempts were made to fix prices and wages to prevent peasants from demanding more due to their increased value. In England, this resistance was formalized in the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which capped peasant wages to pre-plague levels, a measure that contributed to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, and I've done a full video on that, and oh my goodness, it is such a great topic. You owe it to yourself to go and watch that video, or somebody else's video on it. Either way, just learn about the Peasants' Revolt. Well, the plague also led to changes in property ownership, as many land-owning nobles were too dead to really care anymore, and they left their estates to widows and minor children, which may have accelerated the development of new land use practices. But it wasn't all about the people out in the countryside. For urban workers, the plague resulted in a sharp increase in wages. Urban centers had their own labor scarcities. Authorities in Western Europe, including England, attempted to control this through the Ordinance of Labourers Edict in 1349 and the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which of course was one of the laws that froze wages at pre-plague levels, but it also restricted workers' mobility. No more moving around trying to find a better job. No, you have to stay on the plantation. You have to be a good peasant. Well, despite all these efforts, it was simply too hard to enforce. And farm wages in England eventually doubled between 1350 and 1450, although they did remain static until the 19th century. These regulatory efforts may have been less about maintaining wage levels, and more about the elite's fear of the lower class's newfound power and independence. This anxiety was a reaction not just to the economic upheavals, but also to social unrest, including the rather interesting flagellant movement, who, in penance to this perceived curse from God, if we can put it that way, would go around different cities whipping themselves on the back and telling God how sorry they were. Perhaps that will fix the problem. Well, it wasn't just that, of course. The social unrest included this persecution of various groups such as Jews and also Catalans in Sicily, but also beggars, which were seen as this direct consequence of societal stresses induced by the Black Death. The catastrophic population loss stimulated significant technological and agricultural shifts. Labor-saving innovations began to emerge, boosting productivity, and there was this substantial pivot from labor-intensive grain farming to less demanding animal husbandry. This transition was facilitated by the decreased population requiring less farmland, allowing more land to revert to pasture. The widespread deforestation and cultivation that had characterized Europe up until 1200 began to reverse, as abandoned fields simply returned to their natural states. The decimation of the population also accelerated the decline of serfdom in Western Europe. The manorial system, already weakening, was effectively ended in many parts of Western and Central Europe by 1500, simply due to that critical shortage of agricultural laborers caused by the plague. The labor shortage thus led to villages being completely deserted. In England alone, over 1,300 villages were abandoned between 1350 and 1500. Too many bad memories, I suppose. The scarcity of labor then forced landlords to offer better terms of tenure, which, of course, significantly reduced rents across Western Europe. By 1500, a new form of tenure called copyhold emerged, which was a more equitable arrangement, allowing peasants use of the land in return for a fixed annual payment to the landlord, with both parties holding a copy of the agreement. However, serfdom persisted in some parts of Western Europe, and was introduced to Eastern Europe only after the Black Death. Inheritance laws also evolved post-plague. Before the Black Death, typically only the eldest son would inherit property, but the incredible loss of life led to changes which allowed all children, sons and daughters alike, to inherit. Persecutions, of course, increased during and in the wake of the plague, as communities looked for more scapegoats to blame for the devastation. And, as was the style at the time, Jews were often targeted due to their lower infection rates, which some attributed to them being the ones who were putting the poison into the wells. This led to widespread massacres and the destruction of numerous Jewish communities across Europe. But it wasn't just them. There were other marginalized groups, such as friars, beggars, pilgrims, lepers, of course, even just foreigners in general. And don't forget the Romani. They had their share of persecution as well. Women, too, faced increased persecution during this period. In Cairo, for instance, Muslim women were scapegoated for the plague, resulting in restrictive laws prohibiting them from making public appearances to prevent the alleged temptation of men. I fail to see what this has to do with the plague, but, well, that's just the way it is. Well, these laws were only relaxed when the upper classes protested. It made too much of an impact on their domestic arrangements. Well, the Black Death profoundly affected monastic communities, which were often in close contact with the sick who sought refuge there. The disease led to a severe shortage of clergy, as many were simply lost to the epidemic. In response, the process for training clergy was expedited, and new colleges were established at universities to cope with the demand. This often meant that the clergy were hastily trained and lacked the depth of knowledge of their predecessors. Additionally, the shortage of priests opened up new opportunities for lay women, who began to play more significant roles in church services. The period also saw the rise of the flagellants, which I mentioned, groups who engaged in self-flogging as a form of penance, believing that it could atone for the sins and end the plague by showing God how sorry they all were. This movement gained popularity, but faced criticism later for its extreme practices and the eventual hedonism that some members adopted. Despite all the chaos, one group that never really got any criticism was the church. They very rarely got questioned about their handling of the situation. Instead, the societal focus shifted to arts and literature, which took on a more distinctly morbid tone post-1350. Artworks that have shown up through this video, like the Dance Macabre, emerged, depicting skeletons dancing with people from various social classes, symbolizing the universality of death. These images showed the idea that wealth could not prevent the inevitable, a theme that also reflected in the literature of the time. Writers like Boccaccio in Italy vividly described the horror and societal breakdown caused by the plague, emphasizing the massive death toll and overwhelming nature of the epidemic. But among this, a lot of people simply thought, well, we're all going to die. It's the end of the world. Let's all get drunk and party. And that's exactly what they did. In fact, I have a skull that is sitting, not a real one, a skull that is sitting on my bookshelf, which we term a memento mori, remember death. It serves as this reminder of our own mortality. And perhaps if we look at death in this way and have it close by, then we'll utilize our life a little more wisely. Well, in terms of medicine, the Black Death certainly exposed the limitations of the medical knowledge at the time, but it also spurred advances in medical science. there was indeed increased emphasis on anatomical investigations, and the role of surgeons became a lot more prominent. These changes marked a shift towards a more direct engagement with the human body in various states of health. Also, they began to try to move a little bit away from the miasma theory. It took them a while, but there were a few people who were advocating for more modern techniques. See, the miasma theory was essentially linked to bad smells, things like this. You would walk into this cloud and that would not be good for you. Kind of a precursor to bacterial theories, and I don't know much about medicine, but it was kind of on the right track, but not really there yet. Well, another intriguing aspect of the Black Death's impact is its possible influence on genetics. Now, the plague may have played a role in the high frequency of the CCR532 genetic mutation that is among people of European descent, a trait that provides resistance to diseases like HIV and smallpox. While initially thought to be associated with plague resistance, this theory has been challenged by findings that the mutation was just as common in Bronze Age populations. And with that, we end our somewhat deep dive into the Black Plague. I hope you've enjoyed it. Well, I'd like to thank my top-tier patrons, that is Stark Factory, Jeffrey, JC, and Susan. I know you're out there. Thank you very much. If you'd like to support the channel, simply look in the description and you will find the link. But I do hope you've enjoyed this, and I wish you all the best. I hope you've learned something. Until next time, good night.